Hello, my name is David Nolta, and I'm the chairman of the History of Art Department at Massachusetts College of Art and Design, to which you have all been accepted. Congratulations. And the first thing I have to share with you is my excitement and admiration for all of you for being accepted to this great School of Art. As I said, my name is David Nolta, and I teach History of Art, and I'm in fact the chairman of the History of Art Department this year. And but I'm above all, first and foremost, a teacher. So how do you know I'm a teacher? Well, I can already prove that to you because I've already taught you something. Because I've shown you this beautiful sweater that I'm wearing, which is a gift from a friend of mine at the British Museum. And she gave me this gift several years ago, about 4 years ago, and being the kind of thorough friend that she is, she insisted that I try it on for her, and she said that it looked really good on me. So I've already taught you one thing, and the one thing that I've already taught you is that nobody is telling you the truth about your clothes. So that's how you know I'm a teacher. Now, I don't believe in negative advertising, but I want to show you a few images. And these are just to remind you of some of the choices that you'll be making in the next few weeks and months. All things considered, everything will be back on track with the world and with all of us by the fall. And so right now is the time, of course, where you have to think about where you're headed. And so I hope you're headed in the right direction. I don't believe, as I say, in negative advertising, but the truth will out. These are just a few images that I always share. Visual statistics, we'll call them, so that when you make your decisions, you have an open mind and you're well informed. This is one of my favorite images. This is all true, by the way. Now, I'm here because I teach History of Art, and because that is my life, History of Art is my life, I like to share some things with younger students or with new students who are new to college and the college experience. And so I'd like to share some things that we can learn from the history of art, not just from clothing, but from the history of art that will help us as we transition from high school into college and into a professional career and life as an artist. So the first thing I want to share is the very simple fact that good artists make mistakes. And so even great artists make mistakes, the greatest artists in the world, in the history of art. And of course, you probably all recognize this picture by the most famous artist perhaps who ever lived, well known throughout the globe. And his name is Leonardo da Vinci, and this is one of his most famous paintings, The Last Supper, which he painted in the eating room or the refectory of the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. In the last decade of the 15th century, at the moment when the high Renaissance begins. And so we all recognize this, but look at some of the studies that Leonardo did for The Last Supper. Here's a drawing, a red chalk drawing. It shows he didn't have too much room on the page, so he kind of divided the image up as he was thinking about what he was going to paint on the wall of this monastery. And here he is, and you'll see that he's shown Jesus on the upper tier of figures in this preparatory sketch. And Jesus is got his arms extended at the table, as he will have in the finished work. And you'll notice this arm, his right arm. And his right arm is really, really long. And so he got, we know, because we're lucky to have kept all of the things that Leonardo produced. We saved as much of his work as we can, and we know that he got a B- on this exercise because he gave us a Jesus with a really, really long arm. And this was not the first time he had this problem. He'd been having a problem with long arms. Even the great Leonardo had made these mistakes with arms since he was a bright, promising pupil in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. And the first independent picture, one of the first 2 or 3 independent pictures that Leonardo da Vinci painted, that is a painting that he's working on for his own sake, for a private client perhaps, but outside of his school, outside of the studio where he was trained. And that is a little Annunciation, which is still in the Uffizi. And we see here the Annunciation being a standard iconography of Western art. Mary on the right, Mary who's going to be the mother of Jesus if she agrees to the angel's request that which he's delivering from God. Gabriel is on the left and Mary's on the right, and Gabriel's saying, will you be the mother of Jesus? And Mary is flipping through the pages of a book and deciding, yes, she will be the mother of Jesus. Thank you. And so look at the arm, and this reminds me of a story. One of the great short stories that I've ever read in my life, probably the shortest story I've ever read in my life. And it was about a young man who read the literature about studying abroad for the summer. He was one of those people who, like myself, when I was your age and when I was thinking about going to college or just starting college, I believed the lies that people told me that you can travel in Europe on $5 or $10 a day. So many American young people go to Europe thinking they're going to see all the great works of art in Europe, and they're going to live very, very cheaply, but it's not possible. This young man in this story, this very short story, which already is less long than it's taking me to tell you the story, or to summarize it. So this young man, between his freshman and sophomore years, his first year and his second year of college, he goes to Italy, and he brings with him about $300 for 2 months, which is nowhere near enough. And so by the second or third day he's in Rome, he is out of money. And he's got his backpack, and he's exhausted, and he's starving, and he's been sleeping in parks, and he's desperate. And he's just about to give in and call his parents and say, get me out of here, when this beautiful sports car, this beautiful red sports car, convertible, pulls up beside him, and it's being driven by a beautiful young woman, and the young woman says to him, you look tired and you look hungry. Why don't you get in my car and I'll take you for a ride? And of course he says yes, because she's this beautiful Italian. As it turns out, she's a princess. So she's this beautiful Italian princess. And he goes into her sports car and she zooms him off to Trastevere, which is a really good eating part of Rome, eating district in Rome, across the Tiber. And so they're having this spectacular meal. She's this beautiful young woman, just about his age. And she says, I really like you, and I think we should spend a little time together while you're in Rome. And he's thinking, yes, and she's buying him this delicious, huge meal, and they're taking 3 or 4 hours to eat it, and the sun is setting finally when at the end of this lunch, and she says, well, why don't we go back to my place? And they do. They go back in her beautiful red sports car. They go back to her apartment, which is a penthouse apartment in one of the great palaces in Rome, and they are getting comfortable in the living room, and she gives them another drink. They've already had a lot to drink. And then she says, as so often happens, I've been told, she says, why don't we go and lie down in my bedroom? And so they do. They go into her bedroom, which is huge. It's a huge room, much bigger than this study in which I'm imprisoned at this moment. And it's like, 40 feet by 40 feet, and they are slipping out of their clothes. I've heard it happens, and then they're getting into bed, and she says, oh, I forgot to turn the light off, and the light switch is like 35 yards away. And the young man, who can't believe his good fortune with this woman, she's so nice, she's so beautiful, she's so kind, she's so generous. And he says, I'll turn the light off, and he gets up, but she says, no, I'll do it, and she stretches her arm across the room 35 yards and turns off the light. And that's the end of the story. And that's like the arm of the Virgin in Leonardo's early Annunciation, an arm that never ends. Another artist, a younger rival of Leonardo, who also made mistakes like Leonardo, was Michelangelo. Michelangelo was so famous for painting perhaps the most famous room in the history of Western art, which is the Sistine Chapel. He painted the ceiling, as you know, and the altar wall which shows his amazing Last Judgement. When he first went to the Sistine Chapel at the end of the first decade of the 16th century, 1508, he's painting the scenes of the creation on the ceiling, and he's painting the ancestors of Christ and the great prophets and sibyls along the edges of the ceiling. And one of the prophets that he paints is Jonah. And here is a picture of Jonah. Jonah, as you know, was in the belly of a whale for 3 days, and then finally he agreed to do what God said, so the whale was directed by God to let Jonah free and spit him up on shore so he could pursue his mission. And so here is Jonah, having just been spat up by the whale on the entrance wall of the Sistine Ceiling by Michelangelo. Now you tell me if this is a good picture. It's a famous and beautiful and dynamic image of the human form, but that whale, excuse me, no way did that man come out of that whale. And Michelangelo got a C+ on it because it's attractive, but it's not logical. And the Renaissance insisted on some visual logic. How about the most famous and popular artist now in the world, according to the New York Times? You know you can trust them. They're the New York Times. And that is Caravaggio. Everyone loves Caravaggio now. People come from all over the world, especially to see his work in Italian churches and museums. Here's an early work by the famous Caravaggio. And it's a young man. For years it was thought to be a young woman, but then in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, a man discovered the inventories that prove this is in fact a very effeminate man, young man, bearing a basket of fruit. And think about this picture. This is Caravaggio, who insisted he was going to paint everything exactly as it really is. And here is his young man with a basket of fruit from the early 1590s. He's just arrived in Rome. And what do you think about this picture? This is the report card. He got that term. Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio received the following grades, and you'll see he got a really bad grade for collarbones, because that looks more like the whale that swallowed Jonah, if you think about it. And so we have, I think, a fair assessment of his talent with the human form at that early point in his career. Good artists make mistakes, and there's nothing shameful about it because they go on still to be great artists. Another thing is that good artists study art history. So if you come to our school, and I hope you will, I'm sending out vibrations in that direction, welcoming vibrations, not to say insistent vibrations, in that direction, your direction. But good artists study art history, and I teach a class which everyone takes the first term at MassArt. So I'm looking forward to having you begin your formal college-level studies of art history. It's fun to do. And good artists study art history. And we know that, for example, Michelangelo, despite the fact that Michelangelo said he never had a teacher, we know that, in fact, he did go to school. He did apprentice with an older and much more famous artist at the time, Domenico Ghirlandaio. And Domenico Ghirlandaio sent his pupils, like everybody else in Italy, especially in central Italy, in the 15th century, he sent his pupils to draw scenes that were painted by Masaccio, the great early Renaissance artist in Florence. And Masaccio's masterwork in terms of fresco is a series of images in the Brancacci Chapel in Santa Maria del Carmine. And so you're looking at an image of several scenes on the upper zone. He died too young to paint the lower zones. Those were painted by someone else. But the upper zone images show the tribute money, for example, and on the left, the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise. And these were completed by Masaccio in the 1420s. And for 50, 60, 70 years afterwards, all artists who wanted to be good artists, especially in Florence, where this church is, were sent to draw the figures. And even though Michelangelo said, I never had a teacher, we know that he studied with Ghirlandaio, and Ghirlandaio sent him there to draw these paintings, and we know that he did. Here's the tribute money, Jesus telling Peter to pay their taxes by going to the water's edge, and there's a fish waiting there. This is how we all pay our taxes even now. We have someone tell us, send us to the river, and in the river will be waiting a fish with the tax payment in the fish's mouth. And so that's what Peter is doing. You see Peter several times in the scene. One, he's making sure he's got the instructions right from Jesus. Then two, on the left, he's shown with his mantle off, just in his tunic, getting the money, the tax money from the fish's mouth. And then on the far right, he appears fully clad again, fully dressed, paying the tax collector. And we know that Michelangelo studied this and drew from it. And we still have pictures by Michelangelo, drawings that he did as a young man, because clearly he learned from Masaccio. Masaccio was long dead. He learned from Ghirlandaio, who told him to go and draw from the great works that had already been created. So good artists know art history and study it, whatever they say. Keep in mind this beautiful work on the far left of the Brancacci Chapel, one of the most powerful pictures in the history of Western art. This Masaccio's representation of the sword-bearing, fiery red-dressed angel chasing poor Adam and Eve out of Eden because they disobeyed the rules. They, as you all perhaps know, whatever your backgrounds, you probably know the story of the primal sin of Adam and Eve. They were told by God, not by Christ. Christ is God for some people, but they were told by God not to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they did it. The snake convinced them it was a good idea. They did it. They realized they were naked, and they get kicked out of heaven. And it's quite an amazing picture. It's for me, it's the most concise, the most compact image of the whole range of human despair in a very small space. You have Eve, who looks like she's being raked by the light. It looks like the light of the world burns into her. That's her guilt as well. And she throws her head back. She covers her breasts and her genitals, but she throws her head back. Her eyes are voids. Her mouth is open. She is clearly letting out a scream or a wail. So she represents extroverted unhappiness, the despair that expresses itself in noise and sorrow. And then her consort, Adam, who goes inside, doesn't care that people can see his genitals. He's not covering them. He's covering his face. He's gone back inward, and he's retracted, and he's silent. So we have really a whole spectrum of human grief at the commission of this first sin. Michelangelo was clearly struck by this and challenged by it. And because he studied art history, he was intimately familiar with Masaccio's representation of the expulsion of Adam and Eve. And so when 100 years after Masaccio, he comes to paint the Sistine Ceiling, he will include among the spinal scenes in the center, the scenes of creation, he will include the representation of the temptation, the Satan serpent convincing Adam and Eve to eat the fruit, and then in the same image he shows them, as though we see it around the tree, we see another red sword-bearing angel, red-dressed sword-bearing angel chasing Adam and Eve out of heaven, or out of paradise, or out of Eden. And so here they are together. You can see that Michelangelo was taking the challenge from Masaccio. And so we have Michelangelo's also concise representation of the scene, but I don't think he's really surpassed. I think it's fair for us to be subjective a little in our judgments about great artists, and I think it's fair to say that Michelangelo hasn't surpassed the impact of Masaccio, but he doesn't stop trying. He doesn't give up. Michelangelo doesn't give up. So 25 years later, when he comes back to the Sistine Chapel to paint the end wall, the altar wall with the Last Judgement, he gives us another attempt at taking on Masaccio's expulsion from paradise. And he gives it to us in a detail. For me, the most frightening detail in the entire Last Judgement is this image of a damned person. We have the blessed being lifted out of their graves on the left and being taken up into heaven, and they swarm around Jesus, returned to the world with his mother and all the great saints in the upper zone. But in the lower right zone, we have this terrible scene of a Dante in hell, where people are being tortured and dragged back to be to their fate, which is to suffer eternally in the inferno, or in hell. And one of the most powerful details there is this image of a poor condemned man, a man who has not lived well, being dragged down into hell, out of the sky, down to the earth, and down to the flaming pit, you could say. And it's a terrifying image. First of all, there's nothing for me scarier than things that are upside down. I'm not trying to scare you, but I'm assuming that you'll all be coming to MassArt next year. But just think, if you don't come, that's okay too. You may go on to have a wonderful career. But 20 or 30 years from now, for all you know, I might turn up. You'll be living in a penthouse yourself, perhaps, an upper story of a great high-rise in an urban area. And it'll be probably an October night, scary, dark, rainy, windy, and it'll be like 2 a.m. and you'll hear a knocking on your bathroom window, even though you're 24 flights up. And when you look out the window, I'll be there upside down, saying, "Why didn't you go to MassArt?" So you don't want that to happen, because it's scary when things are upside down. This poor man is being dragged into hell, but you'll notice what he's done, what Michelangelo's done here. He has created an even more concise, even more compact image of grief than Masaccio's expulsion of Adam and Eve, where you have the extroverted, crying Eve and the introverted, silent Adam. You have them combined into a single figure who's exposed and not exposed, who's expressive but also hidden, also inside, as introverted as well as extroverted. So Michelangelo doesn't give up, and he doesn't give up on the challenges he faces that are posed to him by the history of art. And you have to know the history of art to accept those challenges and also to go beyond them. Good artists also, I want to say, capture you, and they do that literally. So here's a beautiful picture in the Cloisters Museum, part of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It's in the upper part of Manhattan, the northern part of Manhattan. Oh, many of you have been there. If you haven't been there, I know you'll all go there at some point. It's a beautiful picture from about 1426, painted by an artist named Robert Campin, and a Flemish artist working in the Netherlands, as the area of Belgium and the Netherlands as we know it today were then called, or were then thought of as being this great kind of conglomeration of sort of smaller cities and towns. And so Robert Campin is painting in the early Renaissance, and he paints a triptych. It's called the Moroni Altarpiece, and on the left scene you have the donors. They're looking into the scene. We read in the west from left to right, and then in the center you might recognize the iconography. Once again, it's the Annunciation. Gabriel is coming in to say to Mary, who's reading a book, sitting on the floor, kind of reading a book with her arm propped up against a bench. The 8 Gabriels come to say to Mary, "You can be the Mother of God if you agree." And then in the third section, the third part of the triptych, we have St. Joseph, who's going to be the stepfather of Jesus, and he's shown, as always, in the Middle Ages and later, as an older man. He's not supposed to be a sexual character in the story. He's going to protect Mary and Jesus. That's his job. He's going to stand in for God, the father of the baby. And he's an artist. He's always, even in the Middle Ages, he's shown as he's thought of as being a carpenter, and a carpenter is an artist. So he's shown in a medieval role. He's building a mousetrap. He's drilling holes to make a mousetrap. He stands in for the artist because St. Joseph is a patron to some extent of artists, and he was an artist. So it's fascinating to see how many grills we have in this picture. We have grills in the background of the scene of the Annunciation. St. Joseph himself is seated at a bench, which has also got a grill at the top of the back. There's a fire screen in the Annunciation, which also has holes in it. It's as though St. Joseph is making the things in this picture. And it reminds us that St. Joseph stands in for Robert Campin, the artist who made the picture. St. Joseph is drilling holes in wood to make a mousetrap for the devil. He's going to trap the devil. That's his job, symbolically. But the picture that the artist has produced here, the artist who was like St. Joseph as a maker, he's created in this triptych, in this picture, he's created a trap for our eyes. So he's created something we fall into. And you really, when you see it in the cloisters, it really is like a hole in the wall. You fall into this picture, and you come into it because the artist tells us how to come into the picture. You come into it the way we tend to read in the West, from left to right. And so we're looking at the picture in the same way that we're told to look in the picture, the way that the man and woman who paid for the painting are looking through the door at the left into the main scene, into the central scene. So we enter it the way they enter it, from left to right, and then we're not the only ones who enter it. There's also wonderful details that show that the baby Jesus, a little homunculus baby Jesus, a little tiny mini Jesus with his cross looking almost like a dart that's been thrown across the room. He's sliding quite quickly because it's a steep light ray slide. He's sliding into the room through another grill, miraculously, right through the window, and he's sliding down, and he's aimed right at the Virgin's womb, and that's where he's going to wind up, and because she's going to say yes. And so you've got a great deal of movement from left to right. And how does the artist make us stay? This is a static work of art. A painting is a static work of art. And so if you're going to tell a story such as the story of the Annunciation, how do you inject time into a static work of art? It's one of the great challenges that all artists face in the history of global art. How can a sculpture, how can a photograph, how can a painting tell a story which can only really exist over time? Narrative is synonymous with change over time. So how can you do that? Well, he's trapped our eye in this hole. He's given us a beautiful three-dimensional space here, and he's slowed us down by giving us all kinds of things going on inside the picture. Not only the baby Jesus zooming in from the left, but also the candle smoke, which creates a wonderful little linear pattern as the candle has just been blown out. The flipping pages of the book, the eye is trapped here and follows and concentrates on these various details, and in that way it is fulfilling the artist's goal of bringing your time into the picture in which he's positioned you, in which he's even, we could say, trapped you. And good artists do trap you, and no one is a greater artist in trapping you and telling you a longer story in a static work than Leonardo. So here, once again, we've come back to Leonardo's Last Supper, and I want to just say very briefly, what is he doing here? He's not just giving us the time it takes for the angel to come in and deliver a message to a woman, and the time it takes our eyes to scan in our cage that the picture of the Annunciation becomes. Not just the time it takes for our eyes to scan these images, these separate details. Leonardo is giving us the whole history of the world in his Last Supper. And so what do I mean by that? Look at it a little more closely. Paints this on the wall. He gives us the same wonderful perspectival, single vanishing point perspectival grid. And it's a wonderful thing to see because it really does seem to open up the wall. It's not a flat wall, right? The illusion is that the room continues with loftier figures inhabiting it, perhaps. These are apostles, they move on a greater scale than we tend to move. So the monks eating their suppers down below, they may not feel that they're quite up to this setting, but the apostles are like us. They're three-dimensional. The space is like the space we're in. But Leonardo isn't just giving us the moment that Jesus says. This is the Last Supper, so this is the moment which Jesus says, tomorrow, we've had a great time together, my friends, but tomorrow I will be dead on a cross. That's about as shameful and horrible as it gets. And so there's this bombshell moment. Every book that describes this picture, they can't help but use the word bombshell. It's a bombshell moment. It's just a split moment in time. And Jesus is just saying, I'll be dead tomorrow afternoon. And the apostles are reacting with horror and shock. In the Renaissance, horror and shock is beautifully balanced and symmetrical. So there is harmony in the chaos. That's a Greek idea that Leonardo is reviving. This wonderful concordia discourse. Harmony, though everything's just, we've lost control of the world. So he's giving us that moment, that bombshell moment, but he's also giving us with this beautiful perspectival grid, which radiates from Jesus. Jesus's head is the vanishing point in the perspectival grid. And so not only do we have Jesus saying goodbye, I'll be dead tomorrow afternoon, and it's a shock, but we also have Jesus radiating all of creation from this moment. So all the orthogonals, all the diagonal lines, the ceiling and the decorations on the walls, they all follow these wonderful orthogonals, and they all come out of Christ. So Christ is not only saying goodbye, he's also creating everything in the world. And if you go to see this, or even if you just look at the picture in a book, if you go to Milan, if you're lucky enough to see it, you can see that Leonardo has considered that you too, in front of this image, occupy a unique intersection of orthogonals on the space-time continuum. This isn't just about Jesus saying goodbye. It's about Jesus creating the whole world throughout all time, including you. And it's also the crucifixion, because all of those orthogonals, all of those lines that Jesus radiates in the picture also converge on him, and they pin him down to the center of his own creation. They transfix him like a butterfly on a board. And so he is the creator of all things. He is the sacrificial victim at this moment, or soon to be, and then he's also the victim of all of his creation. And that's a lot of time to get into a static work of art. I have only one or two more helpful hints. If you have a gun and you have a cat, I would beg you, please don't leave them alone together. And I can't help but leave you with this image because it's important and true. I want to show you that I believe the shirt has actually, oh my God, it's burned right through. I was going to take this off. Okay, I hope to see you next year, and thank you for listening.